from Washington, D.C.
We hit them hard yesterday, and we're going to hit them again hard today, in case you miss it, in case you don't turn on your television set. And we'll see what happens with the deal. We were really close to a deal, but they keep tapping us along. They keep playing us for suckers because, you know what? They dealt with some very stupid presidents.
Tonight, hit them hard. Trump weighs additional strike options against Iran, with the flare-up in tensions driving oil prices higher and stocks to a 5-week low. Plus, price spike, gas prices driven higher by the Iran conflict push inflation to a 3-year high in May. The president's response? I love inflation. We'll get reaction from Republican Congressman Ryan Mackenzie of Pennsylvania. Plus, spy power showdown. A key surveillance authority expires in less than 72 hours, with Democrats digging in after Trump tapped Bill Pulte as acting intelligence chief. We'll talk to Senator Rick Scott about the crucial next few days ahead. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Kaylee, we join our audience this evening as President Trump considers his options for Iran. After delivering some strong words for the regime today, as you mentioned, promising to hit them hard again following days of back-and-forth strikes, putting world leaders and global markets on edge. For more, we are joined by Bloomberg's Courtney Subramanian, who's live at the White House, joining us from the North Lawn. Courtney, it's great to have you. What options might the president be considering after meeting with military officials?
Well, the president didn't detail what his options may be or any targets he planned to focus on, but he did confirm in an Oval Office signing ceremony this morning that he intends to continue these renewed attacks on Iran as the talks for this interim peace deal continue, as this White House tries to continue to exert pressure on Iran to sign a paper, as he said in the Oval Office. The president was asked about what he meant when he said in his early morning social media post that Iran would pay the price. And he said, we hit them hard yesterday, we're going to hit them again. But again, we still don't know what exactly that will look like.
Well, and of course, this was not the only social media post and commentary we got from President Trump today. He also took to Truth Social, Courtney, to underscore that Bill Pulte will serve on an acting basis as Director of National Intelligence starting July 19th, or June 19th, rather. The president suggesting he's looking for someone else to fill that role on a permanent basis and asking for a short-term extension of FISA. Does he believe he'll get it from Congress after he spoke with the Speaker again today?
Yeah, that post came just before reporters entered the Oval Office for the signing ceremony. He met with House Speaker Mike Johnson and other Republican leaders, and he really emphasized that Pulte would be a short-term solution to Tulsi Gabbard's departure. He mentioned that he was interviewing 5 candidates for a more permanent role. He seemed to be trying to head off some of the skepticism by Republicans about Pulte's nomination and Democrats who have vowed to block the reauthorization of the FISA Section 702 surveillance program. It's unclear if this is enough to really move the conversation along, but the president is digging in. He mentioned, he thought that Bill Pulte was a smart guy when asked about his lack of national security experience, and he seems to be sticking with him despite this pushback on Capitol Hill.
All right, Bloomberg's Courtney Subramanian from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. Now, the president's renewed threat to attack Iran shook Wall Street today, with the S&P 500 tumbling to a 5-week low and chip makers falling once again. With more in tonight's Power Brief is Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick from New York. Romaine.
Yeah, that sentiment shift that we've been seeing in markets play out over the last couple of weeks really intensified today, really for 3 reasons. First, it was that hot CPI report. Then it was some concerns about the AI trade. But, of course, that aggressive rhetoric that we heard from the president earlier today with regards to the situation in Iran, that had a lot of people heading for the doors. You saw a slight uptick in yields. You saw a slight uptick in oil prices. But more importantly, you saw a pretty significant downtick in the average, in the major benchmark indices. The S&P down 1.6% on the day. The NASDAQ indices each down about 2%. And then we talk about what the potential upside is. If you were looking for safety today, you found that in healthcare stocks, but you also found that, Kaylee, And of course, a lot of the energy stocks, the XOP, the main ETF that tracks a lot of those energy names, did post a green on the day. Names like Devon Energy, Chevron, as well as Murphy, all rising on the idea here that not only will we continue to see that spike in energy prices, oil and gas prices, but that might actually be a little bit more persistent than some people thought. Remember, it was just a few days ago. A lot of people in this market were starting to price in the possibility that we would have a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. And at least based on the rhetoric that we heard earlier today, that does not appear like that's going to happen anytime soon. I also want to draw your attention to the trucking stocks, which sold off today. And that was largely because of a big move by Amazon to move into what we call the less than truckload space. That put a lot of pressure on names like Old Dominion Freight, as well as FedEx Freight, which was just spun off last week from FedEx.
Mm-hmm. Tough night for Oracle, Romaine, out with earnings, showing big growth, but big CapEx. It's a sell everything AI situation here.
Well, when you say big growth, that's an understatement. 92% growth in that main cloud services business, which is, of course, the business everyone cares about. But, of course, Joe, we've talked about this before. It's sort of the curse of high expectations. And more importantly, the curse of, well, how much it costs to fund this stuff. Now, Oracle did say, which has already gone to the debt markets for tens of billions of dollars, said for the calendar year 2026, it's done going to debt markets. Now, a lot of people don't believe that. They say that this could maybe involve some sort of equity issuance or something of the like. You see the shares being sold off in the after hours trade as that conference call is now underway, down about 7%. A company, we should point out, that is actually well below its all-time high that it set all the way back in September of last year. So believe it or not, what was basically one of the best performing stocks in the AI space the last couple of years has now become one of the biggest laggards.
Well, I'll remember that Stargate rally. Romaine, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, live from New York. And joining us now to talk about the latest developments on Iran and other issues, Congressman Ryan Mackenzie, Republican from Pennsylvania, member of the House Foreign Affairs and Homeland Security Committees. Congressman, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for standing by. It does appear that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is going to expire on Friday. FISA 702. We've been talking about it for weeks now, and here we are. Is the problem Congress, Representative, or is it President Trump's choice of Bill Pulte to be the country's next DNI?
Yeah, the problem that we face right now is a series of conflicting interests from different stakeholders in Congress who want to see continued reforms to FISA, building on the reforms that they made 2 years ago. Very serious and significant reforms that tightened up that program to protect America's personal information. At the same time, they would like to see some additional reforms there. That is the main crux of this disagreement. That's why we've seen these short-term extensions. But at the same time, we cannot let this program lapse. It is so critical to our national security. It's what goes into the president's daily intelligence briefings. It's what goes into all of our IC community briefings, and that intel cannot go dark. So we need to make sure that we extend FISA, whether it's short-term or long-term, but we cannot let that program go dark.
Well, so if the Speaker, as we understand it, is planning on putting a short-term extension on the floor tomorrow under suspension of the rules, are the votes there to get 2/3 of the chamber, Congressman?
I think when people are pressed and have a choice between letting the program go dark or continue negotiations for additional reforms, they're going to extend the program. And so if the Republicans are the side that has to provide all of those votes again, then that is what we will do. So I think, again, the short-term extension, if it comes over from the Senate on their hotline, we're going to be able to pass that through the House. Now, at the same time, we got to get out of this cycle of these short-term extensions. We need full, longer-term extension to FISA to have that stability for our intelligence community. That's ultimately what we need, and I think we will get there, but at this point in time, it looks like another short-term extension is probably the most likely outcome.
Bring us inside the Foreign Affairs Committee and the debate surrounding the next steps in Iran, Congressman. We heard the president at length today, and his promise is to hit him hard again today. We could be doing so right now, basically, from what he told reporters in the Oval Office. Is that the right course? Is resuming strikes against Iran the only way to actually force a deal?
The right approach is to get a negotiated peace settlement here, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and have long-term peace and stability in that country. The challenge that the Iranians are facing— Do you need military leverage
to do it?
It has to be something that is always on the table. When you're dealing with the Iranians right now, they have multiple actors who are trying to take the position, the mantle of power in that country. That power struggle is not settled, and it is continuing. And so there are competing interests in their country about what the best path forward is. If they want to get to that negotiated peace settlement, or if they want to have continued conflict with the United States. And what we've been seeing is that right now, in a settled peace situation, the Iranians and some of their actors go and attack American interests and American military. So that is, again, where this conflict is coming in play. That Iranian leadership doesn't have an actual plan of how they're going to move forward, but we need to proceed in a way that we want the negotiated settlement, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, deactivate your nuclear capabilities, and military actions are going to continue to be on the table if you target American military interests.
Well, where should the U.S. draw the line on those military actions? As we've heard the president suggest he would be open to targeting civilian infrastructure.
Yeah, that is something that, again, he talks about. That is not what we are focused on at this time. We are focused on getting that peaceful resolution. And actually taking down, whether it's energy, infrastructure, or other things, will not help the long-term problem. And so we need to make sure that we are focused on retaliatory actions. If it's in the military space, that is certainly something that should be on the table. Otherwise, the peaceful negotiation is what needs to proceed.
I see you're paying above the national average for a gallon of gas in Pennsylvania, Congressman. It's at $4.29. Is this part of the game here? Is it worth it? Is it worth the cost to consumers in your district?
It's something that we never like to see, is people dealing with high prices and inflation that ravaged people for 4 years during the Biden administration. Those prices remain high. It is still a challenge for so many people in our community. So we need to continue to push forward actual reforms, bringing more energy supply online so that we aren't dependent upon the Iranians in conflict situations like this. And we have great permitting reform legislation that we've been advancing. Hopefully we can get done this Congress. But again, opening up more American energy brings more supply online, ultimately reduces our dependence on foreign adversaries, and puts us in a more stable situation in the long term. So that is what we need to continue to focus on. And when the Strait of Hormuz opens up, the prices will come down pretty quickly on the price of gasoline at the pump.
Well, the president does contend that that will happen, but he also suggested today that the inflation figures we saw with consumer prices accelerating the most in 3 years weren't that much of a problem. This is what the president said in the Oval Office earlier.
I love the inflation. You know why? Because as soon as this war is over, you know, I can say it now. Something you didn't know. Do you know we've been taking out millions of barrels of oil? Nobody knows it. You know who doesn't know about it? Iran, until right now.
I love the inflation. Congressman, is that a helpful thing for the president to say as a member who sits in a swing seat?
Again, what we have seen is we've seen inflation be cut in half from where it was during the Biden administration. We would like to see that number continue to come down. And I think you've seen the peak when you look at the actual data. You see the year-over-year inflationary numbers might have ticked up a little bit, but the month-over-month numbers have actually peaked and started to cool. So that inflationary pressure from the price of gasoline is now something that is coming down. That's what we would like to see. We need to continue this path forward. And ultimately, you are going to see, by the time we get to an election, prices will significantly come down. People are going to start to see that relief at the gas pump. That's something that, again, is going to benefit people in our local community, and that is the ultimate outcome that we're looking to achieve here.
I appreciate a very straightforward answer on that, Congressman, but have you ever met anybody who loved inflation before?
You know, I think what people are looking for is they want to see their wages go up. And so we need to make sure that we're building in an economy that is prosperous, that is growing, so that people have that wage growth in their income. But what we saw during the Biden administration, that high rate of inflation led to a wage spiral, where to keep up with those high prices, people needed raises. They still need raises. But then that triggers a knock-on effect where people have to raise prices again. And so we're dealing with some of that high inflation and that wage spiral from previously. Again, we need to make sure that people continue to get those increases, though, so they can deal with those high prices that were built in after 4 years of inflation.
Well, the president suggests one way to bring more wealth to people, Congressman, is for having the U.S. government have a stake in big AI companies. Do you support that notion?
I don't think that's the right approach. I think what we want to see is we want AI companies here in the U.S. to be the leaders in this space. Obviously, we need to continue to outpace China, but it is so critically important for our economy. You see in the stock market, what is driving that forward is the AI build out, all of the different parts of the stack where you're seeing this massive investment because there is so much potential to increase American workers' productivity. And that's what we should be after. That is where you're going to see real prosperity for Americans. If you can drive productivity, that gets passed on to the whole economy and to American workers as well. So we want to continue this process. We obviously need to make sure that we are doing it in a responsible fashion. Local communities are protected and their interests are secured. But at the same time, there's a lot of potential for the American economy that I think is waiting and on deck here.
All right, Congressman, thanks for joining us. Congressman Ryan Mackenzie, the Republican from Pennsylvania. We appreciate it. And still ahead, we'll stay on Capitol Hill and get the take from the other chamber when Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida joins us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We have to extend FISA. To me, as a New York Republican in a post-9/11 world, I think there's a few things that are more critical at this moment, and to make sure that that FISA authority remains with the intelligence community. It has stopped terror attacks. It has provided necessary information to keep our country safe, and it is critical that it does get extended.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And that was New York Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis commenting on the state of negotiations over the renewal of Section 702 of FISA, set to expire in less than 72 hours. Senate leaders and House leaders are now pushing for a 3-week short-term extension of the spy powers after the original bipartisan deal to renew them was disrupted by Trump's tapping of Bill Pulte as the acting director of national intelligence. Joining us now for more from Capitol Hill is Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committees. Senator, welcome back to Bloomberg. I know you have taken issue with FISA authority in the past. Are you prepared to vote for a short-term extension?
Absolutely. But what I don't understand is why do we have to keep kicking the can down the road? We need to all get in a room and do what we want. I mean, look, all of us want to be able to surveil foreigners. None of us want to surveil Americans. It's pretty simple. So how do we set up the safeguards to do that? Now, we know under Biden, 3 million Americans were surveilled. I've had 3 experiences. After January 6th, I was surveilled. During the Biden years, they stole my tax returns. Booz Allen did, and nothing happened to them. And during the Clinton years, when I went against Hillary here, they targeted my company. So let's fix this. It's not that hard.
Well, Senator, I understand your personal experiences, and we can talk more about them if you want to. But is the issue here really now about reforms to the program, or is it really just that President Trump nominated or tapped someone to be the acting director of national intelligence that no party seemed to have real appetite for?
Well, look, Bill Pulte, I voted for him already for another job. I mean, he'll go do the job. I mean, Democrats aren't going to support anything Trump's doing. I mean, it doesn't matter if he had appointed Mother Teresa, they would have opposed that. So this has nothing to do with Bill Pulte. This has to do with the Democrats who want to slow down everything Trump wants done. We need to extend FISA. Let's all agree we need to extend FISA, but there has to be reform to make sure Americans are not surveilled. It's simple as that. And by the way, who's ever gotten held accountable? Nobody. Nobody's ever been held accountable for surveilling Americans, and so it doesn't make you feel good about the process.
Yeah. Well, Senator, we have talked to a number of Republicans who seem uncomfortable with the Pulte appointment, including Congressman McCall, who's pretty close to, obviously, the intelligence community and foreign affairs. He said it's giving a lot of Republicans, and many in his conference, at least in the other chamber, heartburn was the word that he used. What does a home builder know about intelligence? Is experience not important here?
Well, first off, this is a process job to organize information and give it to the president. That's what the job is, right? Yeah. So, but let's remember, if the issue here is FISA, so let's focus on FISA, get it extended, and make sure they don't surveil Americans. That's what we ought to be talking about, not who got appointed as a director of national intelligence.
Well, as we consider what our intelligence gathering efforts are helping inform, let's get to the conflict in the Middle East. Senator, President Trump suggested that the U.S. will be attacking Iran once again very hard. Is the military course of action the only one ultimately that can lead to a victorious outcome for the United States at this point?
Well, if there's anybody that can get a deal done, it's President Trump. And I know he's tried. He's given them time to come to a table, and they just haven't. So I don't think he has a choice. None of us want Americans to be killed with a nuclear weapon. We know that Iran has been killing Americans for 47 years. We know they want to kill us. We know they want a nuclear weapon. So he basically does not have a choice. If they're not going to negotiate with him, right, he's going to have to use the military to make sure we don't get killed. Like, he's doing the right thing to protect American life. And I wish our prior presidents had done the same thing. Unfortunately, they didn't.
You know, there are many who don't believe we will ever arrive at a deal with Iran, and we couldn't trust a deal to begin with that's put on paper. So when we talk about finishing the job, Senator, what should the president be considering tonight?
Well, I think what he should be considering is how is he going to make sure that never, ever do they have a nuclear weapon. So I think it's going to require...
Does that include seizing Karg Island, for instance, forcing the reopening of the Strait? How tough does the president need to get?
Well, it sure looks like he's going to have to really demolish every opportunity that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has to continue to govern. I mean, they're the ones that are in charge right now, and so he's sort of stuck. He doesn't want Americans killed, so he's going to have to destroy them. I think he's doing the right thing. I don't want my family killed by nuclear weapons or your family.
Well, so when we consider what it will take to destroy Iran, the president has suggested targeting civilian infrastructure in the past. Senator, should the U.S. draw the line there, knowing that that is seen as an international war crime?
Well, look, we've got to do, we're in a conflict with somebody who wants to kill Americans. I want the president to do everything under his power to make sure my children and my grandchildren do not get killed by a nuclear weapon. I don't want your children or your grandchildren eventually. So what we've got to do, the president's got to have all the options on the table, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has to know that the president is going to make sure they don't have a nuclear weapon. So whatever that takes, he should do.
We've been having a conversation in Washington that is kind of interesting to see the president get involved in, Senator, and that's the idea of taking stakes in AI companies. He said that he's going to have a meeting at the White House with a dozen or so of the biggest stakeholders in the industry, the executives of the major hyperscalers and other companies that are involved. Is that something, as a former entrepreneur, that you think is a good idea? Would it help to control this emerging technology?
Well, I'd like to hear why he's doing it. I personally never would want government as my economic partner. When I was built my companies, I don't think government's a great partner. So I like to understand why he thinks it's a good idea. We do have to do whatever we can to continue to promote innovation and make sure we beat China on AI. And I think we're heading in the right direction. We got great companies.
If you ask Bernie Sanders, it's to spread the wealth, right? He wants the money to go to the people. If you ask Bernie Sanders, it's about spreading the wealth. Is this even the playing field for Americans?
Well, look, I'm up here because I want to make sure every American has the same shot a poor kid like me had to live the American dream. I grew up in public housing, got to build companies. So and the way you do that is you give people opportunity. You don't have government make all the rules. You don't run $2 trillion a year deficits. You get rid of inflation. You give opportunity to people, and they'll go thrive under that.
Well, Senator, as we consider people's opportunity and the resources that they're working with, we obviously got a report from Social Security and Medicaid entitlement programs yesterday that look like they could end up having to go dark in just a number of years. 2032 for Social Security. What needs to be done to address that? Well,
let's get to work. I mean, it's pretty simple. We're going to have, I think it's a 24% reduction if we don't do in 2032 in benefits if we don't figure out how to do this. But up here, what do we do? Let's have a committee. It doesn't do anything. Let's have a bill. It doesn't do anything. We got to get everybody on. It's got to be a Republican, Democrat, and everybody sit down at the table and say, look, we want to preserve Social Security. I'm going to bust my butt to preserve Social Security. It's very important to people in my state. Same with Medicare. Medicare is going bankrupt in a few years. The trust fund will. So we've got to show up. But it starts with balance the darn budget. We can't run $2 trillion deficits and think, oh, we're going to have all this extra money to preserve Social Security and Medicare. We won't.
All right, Senator, thank you for joining us. Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida, live on Capitol Hill this evening. And as we spoke with the senator about what it will take to finish the job in Iran, former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley is of the mind that President Trump needs to do that militarily. She joined us on Balance of Power earlier today with her thoughts on the conflict, as well as the results of the primary race for the governor's mansion in South Carolina that she once occupied, with President Trump's preferred candidate advancing to a runoff. Here's part of our conversation.
You always have to look at what your adversary is thinking. For them, they're not looking to win, they're looking to survive. So there's a difference. What they think is if they can put enough political pressure on this administration, if they can put enough economic pressure on this administration, they think the U.S. will cave to a weak deal. This is the same playbook Iran has always done. They stall, they start talking, they make you think you're going to get a deal, they throw cold water on it, and all the while, they're strategizing, they're rearming, they're getting ready for the next conflict. Iran was never going to do a deal. They are never going to get rid of their nuclear ambitions. That's their number one priority. Now they've actually found more leverage with the Strait of Hormuz. And so they don't want to go back to what it was pre-war. They now want to have sovereignty over the strait. They want to make sure that they have the threat of nuclear ambition, and they're going to continue to do that. So I think Trump was right to strike yesterday, but the idea of a deal, that's just not in their cards. One of the surprising things that's not talked about, they have excavated 50 of the 69 tunnels that hold missiles. They're rearming. Now, that's not enough. We've weakened Iran tremendously, but it shows you how they think.
Well, so if Iran is never going to make a deal, and the U.S. is now obviously bogged down in the Middle East for some time in the absence of one, are we coming out on the losing side of this, Ambassador?
No, the only option is to win. Trump has to finish what he started. And the key is stop waiting for a deal, finish it. They're very weak. But what you have to do is go after their finances. What has not, and what the administration should do, is go after Russia and China. Russia right now is providing them drones. China says they want this hostility to end, yet they are providing them man pads for air defense systems. They provided satellite imagery so that you can hit our military bases. If you go after those two, they're providing money. If you go after those two, that's going to take away Iran's ability to help. The second thing is you do have to acknowledge Kharg Island is where they get their revenues from. And at some point, that's going to have to be addressed. But what they're doing is they're creating a distraction. You know, what they've said is, well, Israel is hitting Lebanon. No, Israel's hitting Hezbollah, the terrorist regime in Lebanon. The Lebanese people don't like Hezbollah. And so the key is Iran's going to keep making excuses. They're going to keep creating distractions. At the end of the day, they just want to survive. They just want to make it another day.
If, in fact, we went pedal to the metal and took the advice of Nikki Haley, how long would it take?
Stop negotiating with them.
Okay.
That's never going to happen. We've lost time. Go finish what you started. I think within a week to 2 weeks.
Is that right?
They could.
Long before the midterms.
Well, a week to 2 weeks, they could. It would take them the amount of time to extract the nuclear enrichment that they have.
Seize
I think
Kharg Island.
You'll have to have special forces there. To go and hold Kharg Island is going to obviously take a little bit longer, but this is one where they need to be focused and mission driven on go after the revenues that are going to Iran, and that's the only way to get rid of the regime. And then the Iranian people have no way to defend themselves. They've killed thousands of people in the streets and made examples of them. What's happened in the past is the U.S. has actually helped countries so that the people can rise up. That's the way that this is going to end, is when the people feel safe enough to rise up that they can go and take their country back.
If the U.S. were to pursue the course of action you're describing, do you believe it would be prudent for the president to go to Congress first. Do you see that constitutional necessity that he has consistently denied is necessary?
I always think you need to go to Congress. One, you need the buy-in of Congress. You need the buy-in of the American people. You need to explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you know. And yes, it's just good practice to go to Congress with more. This administration has done a lot by executive order. Yeah. The danger in that is the next administration, if it's not a Republican, all of that gets reversed. And then we're swinging the pendulum. That's not good for the American people. Congress needs to step up. There are a lot of things Congress could be doing, but right now we're hearing a lot of talking and not a lot of action.
The political pendulum also swings as we watch the primary season unfold, and there was a state you know a lot about that was, of course, voting yesterday in South Carolina. The president's endorsements have been on the line quite a bit here more recently, and they paid off last evening, particularly in the race for governor, in the primary for governor. Pamela, Yvette, I'm curious your thoughts on this and what it looks to be the end of a couple of political careers, including Nancy Mace and someone who you endorsed and endorsed you back in Ralph Norman. What transpired last night, and is it good for your party?
Well, I think, first of all, primaries are always good for our party. Yeah. I think that it's very important that you have debate, that you have, them touching as many hands as they can and really getting their message out. So I think having a full primary was a great thing. The press has been covering that Nancy Mace was a factor, and because of the Trump endorsement she lost. Yeah. She was never a factor in this race. Wow. She was always in 5th place. She was never going anywhere.
That was a tough finish.
She knew that, and South Carolina knew that. So, she laid her bed. She's now laying in it. That's what she's doing. Ralph Norman, who I respect and love, we go way back. Mm-hmm. He does what he says he's going to do. He's got real clarity. Certainly I wish he would have made it into the runoff, but he was always pushing, and then you had Evett and Wilson in there. And so, look, it's the power of the Trump endorsement. Mm-hmm. Evett wouldn't have made it in the runoff without the Trump endorsement. So his endorsement is strong. It does move the ball. And, we just have to make sure that who we elect in a primary is who we want to vote for in a general.
You can catch our full interview with Ambassador Haley on the Bloomberg terminal and online. U.S. officials are now pushing EU leaders to enact Ebola travel restrictions ahead of the World Cup as they look to hold off the spread during the biggest sporting event in the world. But that call to Europe comes only after major funding cuts to global aid programs, cuts that experts say have helped lead to the breakout of the disease. In fact, since the last outbreak, U.S. Ebola spending has dropped 99%, with former CDC head Dr. Tom Frieden warning Ebola is showing just how unprepared the world is for the next epidemic. For more, we're joined by Dr. Deborah Birx, former coordinator of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. Doctor, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to have you back on Balance of Power. Did the United States make this worse?
I think people are not looking at the full picture. There'll be plenty of times to step back and quarterback this, but I just want to make it very clear. The cases that got to Uganda was prepared. That was work done in partnership with Uganda for decades. The Minister of Health is superb. They haven't had cases outside of the ones that they've contact traced, and they've only had 1 or 2 deaths, and they have, I think, 18 cases. So that's the tale of a country that Ebola came to, and the response was excellent. Where Ebola is in DRC, the U.S. government never had programs in that far north area. It was always considered incredibly unstable. When they moved into informal mining, this virus, which was probably circulating there for decades in bats, now had access and exposure between humans and bats because of people moving in for informal mines. I've been to those mining camps. They are exquisitely put together with blue tarps, but there is no ability to control any infectious disease in those camps. So when it gets into that camp, it's going to spread, and that's what happened. But why we're behind is because we didn't know about it for almost 2 months. And we have to really look into of how we failed in understanding that this was spreading.
So if we start from behind, is it possible to get ahead, Doctor? What does it take?
Well, it takes what Uganda's doing. And so I just want to be clear. I've worked on the continent for many decades. There are extraordinary Africans on the continent who know exactly what to do with Ebola. I don't know what actually happened for those first 8 to 10 weeks in DRC, and we have to figure it out. But together we built a very strong African CDC. So when people say the American response, well, the Americans have been responding to the needs. But in the end, the African CDC was put there just for this type of outbreak and controlling this type of outbreak. And so we have to ask ourselves why our institutions that we all funded didn't respond as rapidly as they needed to. Now, I know you've seen models. And I want to make it very clear. Anybody who's showing you a model doesn't have enough data right now to create it. Because we don't have a good timeline for when these infections started. We don't have a good case fatality rate, which is significantly less than Zaire, which is very good news. And since the last outbreak of this type of virus, our supportive care has gotten much better, even though we don't have a vaccine or treatments. Our supportive care, IVs, oxygen has gotten much better. And now we just need to make sure that we're supplying people with what they need to be effective. And I think the U.S. government and Europe has been sending in supplies.
What are your thoughts around the World Cup, which seems to be part of this conversation, no matter who you talk to? Doctor, one of the biggest international gatherings since COVID. Is this something that Americans need to worry about? What's the greatest health concern facing the World Cup?
Well, everyone's going to the World Cup. Your biggest risks are when you're in confined areas. Many of these stadiums are wide open, have good air exchange. I don't want people to be nervous that are going to the games. It's going to be very exciting, and they should have a wonderful time. People who have immunodeficiencies should be careful in bathrooms and closed spaces, not because of Ebola, and not because we don't have any COVID actively circulating right now, or flu or RSV, but just the infectious diseases that we all carry that we expose each other to. So, yes, anytime there's human gathering and exchange, but I know the teams and their coaches have been quarantining those that came from the DRC area, and so I'm not at all worried about them. I think people should be having a great time. And if you get sick, you know, it may not have happened there. It may have happened in the airline terminal before you got on the plane. So keep washing your hands, and wash your hands before you eat and after you go to the bathrooms. And I think you'll have a great time.
I just want to mention some breaking news that just crossed the terminal. U.S. Central Command is confirming that renewed U.S. attacks on Iran have begun. Central Command forces, according to this post on X, began launching additional self-defense strikes today at 5:15 p.m. Eastern time against multiple targets in Iran at the commander-in-chief's direction. Centcom says the strikes are in response to Iran's unwarranted and continued aggression. But as we saw yesterday at this time with that round of strikes, Centcom is describing this once again as being in self-defense. We'll have to await more detail as to what exactly in terms of targets were struck here. Dr. Birx, before we let you go, as we think about the World Cup and event-oriented risks like that, even if it's not a huge risk when it comes to Ebola, is the world prepared for epidemics and pandemics of the future right now?
Well, I mean, that's why I keep harping back to we have to really ask ourselves what happened in those early days of northern DRC. Because since COVID, we did invest a lot in the African CDC, and we have spent 3 decades investing in laboratory capacity. And one comment I do want to make, because of what we could be helpful to the people of DRC, we have to make sure that pregnant women and young children have access to healthcare facilities in that region where there is Ebola, because they'll be afraid to go to their health center. But malaria is quite rampant there, and we could have more deaths from malaria for kids not getting treated or pregnant moms. So we just have to make sure that our response on the ground is comprehensive. Yes, we're worried about Ebola, but let's make sure that the other diseases that we know are endemic there are also being addressed.
All right, Dr. Deborah Birx, thank you so much for joining us. And to reiterate the breaking news we just received from U.S. Central Command, as of 5 p.m. Eastern time this evening, Centcom has launched additional self-defense strikes against Iran in response to what they describe as Iran's unwarranted and continued aggression. We'll have more on this with our political panel just ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew. And we're coming back to you now with breaking news we've gotten from U.S. Central Command confirming military strikes against Iran began anew just a short time ago, 5:15 p.m. Eastern time, and those strikes are being described as being in self-defense. Now, this also comes as we're just about 72 hours away, less than that, from the expiration of key government spy powers, FISA, Section 702. And lawmakers on Capitol Hill are now discussing a short-term 3-week extension of those spy powers after a longer-term deal for renewal was complicated by President Trump's tapping of Bill Pulte as the acting director of national intelligence. And joining us now for more, live from Capitol Hill, is Bloomberg's Erik Wasson. So, Erik, if it's a short-term deal or a short-term extension, rather, I'm not sure we can really call it a deal. Is it something that can pass in time?
You know, it looks like it's going to be a really tough road for this. Just talked to Hakeem Jeffries, a top House Democrat. He says he's a hard no. That's going to make the math really hard. Speaker Mike Johnson's bringing up this bill. They're starting debate even as we speak in the House and plan a vote at 10:30 tomorrow morning. They'll need 290 or so votes to pass this under the method that they're using, suspension of the rules. And with all the Democratic leaders opposed to it, it's going to be very hard to get to that number. The real ask from Democrats right now is they do not want to see Bill Pulte as even an acting spy chief, even for one day. They want to see, a permanent DNI named by Trump, and in the interim, the deputy, the current career person, to step into that role as acting. So there's a real standoff. It's deepening. We're coming down to the wire here. And people like Chuck Grassley, the head of the Judiciary Committee, are saying, look, we could see another 9/11. We could see a terrorist attack. We need to get this done. And it's really become a high-stakes game of chicken right now.
Well, the president tried to get to this today on social media, saying that he has named William Pulte to be acting director. It'll take over June 19th. So it sounds like that's not going to change, Erik. He goes further to say, at the same time, I'm looking for a permanent ODNI nominee with experience in national security, which one would hope that candidate would have. Is that enough to change any minds, or do lawmakers need a name?
I think they really need a name, but, we had talked to members like Mark Warner, a top intelligence Democrat. Is this enough? And he said no. He not understand giving Bill Pulte the keys to 18 spy agencies even for one day. He said this is someone who couldn't be trusted with confidential mortgage information. He can't be trusted with confidential intelligence information. So Democrats are digging in, and there's a real possibility this could lapse, I'm afraid, on Friday.
Erik, thank you. Bloomberg's Erik Wasson, live on Capitol Hill, and joining us now, our political panel. Roger Fisk is with us, Democratic strategist, former aide to President Obama, and Sarah Chamberlain, Republican strategist and president, CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. It's great to see you both. Welcome back to the table. We're going to have to tap your crystal ball here. Is there time to save FISA from expiration? Will it be a short-term solution?
There's going to have to be a short-term solution. I mean, we have World Cup coming. I mean, there's a lot of things happening. We have to get the Democrats on board to just do a compromise for a few weeks.
There's even some Republicans who've been a little concerned, right?
Congressman
McCall told us he had heartburn over that Pulte.
Yep, but he's not going to be the permanent pick. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously the president's like, okay, I'm putting him in there, but I'm interviewing. He might announce on, June 18th, I'm hiring so-and-so instead. Okay. So we'll have to figure that out. But we have to get this passed, at least short term. There's a lot coming in our country at 250th anniversary. I think we have to have this passed. We don't have a choice. Though I do think the members may be here this weekend trying to work through this.
Well, we all love to see a working weekend in Washington. There's nothing they love more, I know. Roger, talk to me about the risk calculus here for Democrats, because the threat is very real when we consider what these surveillance powers are used with the aim of avoiding. Mm-hmm. Is it worth it for Democrats to let the program go dark over Bill Pulte?
I think ultimately they should go through this kind of symbolic resistance, but ultimately they have to be faithful to their duty and their oath, which at the top of that list is the safety of the country. I do think that the list of FISA is one of the one of the most compelling conversion points that I can think of. And by that, I mean the difference between how people run for office and then how they behave when they get in office. There's a strong element of the MAGA movement that has always been deeply skeptical of FISA. And were he not the chair, someone like a Jim Jordan would be out there making a lot of noise against this. And so when you look at both Republican and Democratic candidates, it's been something that they've all been eager to run against. And then almost invariably they get into office and support it, which tells me that once they can open up the hood and see the engine of what FISA does and what FISA prevents, that sobers them up very quickly. And kind of the conceptual days of the campaign trail take on a very hard, cold reality when they look at what FISA allows this country to prepare for and prevent. So ultimately, I think it will get passed because I think there's consensus philosophically that it's important. But with being in the minority in both chambers, it makes sense that they're going to try to make some noise and some rhetorical hay about this in the meantime.
We talked to Senator Scott about this a little bit earlier in the hour. He's not a big fan of FISA and has been long calling for reforms. He wants to see warrants presented if this involves Americans, but he's still a yes vote, I guess, on a continuing
short-term
resolution. Let's listen to how he put it.
Bill Pulte, I voted for him already for another job. I mean, he'll go do the job. I mean, Democrats aren't going to support anything Trump's doing. I mean, it doesn't matter if he appointed Mother Teresa. They would have opposed that. So this has nothing to do with Bill Pulte. This has to do with the Democrats want to slow down everything Trump wants done. We need to extend FISA. Let's all agree we need to extend FISA, but there has to be reform to make sure Americans are not surveilled. It's simple as that.
Unfortunately, Mother Teresa doesn't have intelligence experience either. Is there a short list that will convince lawmakers to vote for this, and might it come from the Republican conference in the House?
It may. I mean, we certainly
what you need is to lose another member right now.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure we can afford to do that at this point. But there have been a lot of former members that served on the Intel committee, so they are out there. There are real professionals out there that the president's interviewing, so we'll see how it plays out. But we have got to get this passed and let President Trump pick a new one. I mean, this gentleman is not going to be acting for very long, a couple days probably, the way it looks.
I'd like to switch gears and return to the breaking news we got earlier this hour that Central Command has indeed resumed strikes against Iran. They're being described as in self-defense and in response to continued Iranian aggression, Roger. But for all of the talk of Iran being desperate to make a deal, what does it say that the U.S. is now resorting once again to a military option of the corner we find ourselves in?
Yeah, one of the things that I learned doing trade and diplomatic missions is that I understand the eagerness to be out ahead of a lot of this in a communications context. But if you get too aggressive about what this administration has been doing, which is every day it's self-congratulations, it's the dismissing of data that's inconvenient, it's claiming victory, it's claiming ceasefire, it's claiming victory again, and then another ceasefire. They look upon this as it's just a question of getting the spin right, as opposed to the substance and the real diplomatic kind of machinery of the whole thing. So I think that they really need to pick a team that is going to see this all the way through, because I think one of the issues that we've been having is that on any given day it's Witkoff or it's Kushner or it's Marco or it's JD. Just like let's consolidate ownership over this larger dialogue with one specific individual or a team, and then just give them the room to work with the Iranians to get this done. We complain on our side that we still don't know who we're talking to on the Iranian side, and you can understand that they would have some of the same concerns. But this needs to be hammered out diplomatically. And frankly, of all the shortcomings that I've mentioned here at any number of times of the administration, I think the diplomatic muscle of this administration is just not where it needs to be to meet a task of this complexity.
Well, if we're going on back in hard and going back to war, essentially is what we're hearing from the White House here. There's going to be heavy strikes. They're underway right now, apparently, according to Axios, in southern Iran so far. If we're talking about going back to war, essentially, no more ceasefire, does the president need to go back to Congress or go to Congress and ask?
Well, some of the Republicans joined with the Democrats to pass that.
That's right.
So we'll see. Right now, he's going to continue to say no, but eventually I think he is going to be forced to.
Does this get the clock ticking again? You know,
Not yet.
They were suggesting
Not yet.
that war powers weren't necessary because we had paused the war.
We'll have to see how long. Is this a day? I mean,
Right.
does it get longer? I'm not sure how long this offensive is going to take place. But what they're trying to do is get Iran to the table because Iran has been stalling in these negotiations, and Iran is trying to get past November, hoping that the Republicans lose the House and Senate over gas prices.
Wow.
So they're playing a game with the Americans.
Well, and of course, the president seemingly wants to message to Iran that he's not thinking about November when he says things like, I don't care about the midterms or Americans' financial situations. Or today he says, Roger, I love inflation. Even if maybe those are messages targeted at Tehran, that's going to work their way into ads this entire midterm cycle, no?
I think that sound we hear in the distance is editing suites in ad firms all over the country. I think my sense of it is that this president is very reluctant to be pinned down and held to account. And so I think my sense of it, and I'm trying to be empathetic here in a way, is that when he dismisses these things, he's actually more dismissing the idea that people can come around and question him and try to pin him down on these things. I don't necessarily think that he gets up in the morning and actively has disregard for the economic pressures on people's lives. I think it's more that he gets these kind of questions and the response is, who are you to try to box me in on
Think
this?
what?
You think he even meant it?
No,
I love inflation.
I think he hates inflation, but he's trying to get Iran to the table.
All right, Roger Fisk and Sarah Chamberlain, our political panel on Balance of Power today. Thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio.